Snoop Dogg reclined in his plush leather seat, the rhythmic clatter of the luxury train blending seamlessly with the mellow beats playing softly in his headphones. His private cabin was a picture of elegance, polished wood, velvet curtains, and crystal glasses shimmering under the dim, ambient lighting. He had boarded this first-class train expecting a smooth, laid-back journey through the countryside, far from the chaos of the city. But just as he closed his eyes to unwind, the sharp clang of the cabin door sliding open shattered the peace. Two train attendants in crisp uniforms stood in the doorway, their expressions stiff, eyes scanning the cabin like they were expecting trouble. "Excuse me, sir," one of them began, his voice formal yet cold. "We're going to have to ask you to step off the train at the next station." Snoop pulled off his headphones, raising an eyebrow. "Say what now? I paid for this seat, man. What's the problem?" The attendant's jaw tightened. "There have been complaints. Other passengers feel uncomfortable." A slow burn ignited in Snoop's chest, not from anything he had done, but from the unspoken truth hanging in the air. This wasn't about noise, behavior, or breaking any rules. This was something deeper. And Snoop wasn't about to let it slide without a fight. His relaxed demeanor shifted in an instant, his gaze turning sharp and cold as he locked eyes with the attendant. The gentle sway of the train beneath his feet suddenly felt less like part of a luxurious journey and more like a stage for something he never signed up for. The polished wood walls of the cabin, the murmur of conversation from the other first-class passengers, the faint clinking of glasses in the dining car, all of it faded into the background. "Complaints, huh?" Snoop repeated, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "Funny, I don't remember causing any problems." The younger attendant shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to his colleague as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. But the older man, rigid, stone-faced, with an air of authority that felt more like a challenge, stood his ground. "We've had multiple reports," he insisted, his voice clipped. "Passengers are concerned about your presence." Snoop leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His trademark shades reflected the soft lighting, but behind them, his eyes were sharp, reading between the lines. "Your presence." They didn't even bother to come up with a real excuse. "You sure it's my presence," he said slowly, "or you just don't like seeing someone like me in here?" The older attendant's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. That silence told Snoop everything he needed to know. The hum of the train beneath Snoop Dogg's feet felt different now, less like the smooth ride he'd been enjoying, and more like a ticking clock counting down to a confrontation. He shifted slightly in his plush leather seat, feeling the coolness of the polished armrest under his fingertips. The gentle sway of the luxury cabin, once soothing, now felt like it was pushing him towards something inevitable. The two attendants stood rigid in the doorway, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable except for the tension tightening their jaws. The older one's voice still echoed in Snoop's mind, "We're going to have to ask you to step off the train at the next station." Snoop slid off his headphones, letting them rest around his neck. The soft beats that had been playing faded into the background, replaced by a different rhythm, the steady, deliberate beat of his heart. Snoop wasn't quick to anger. Years in the game had taught him the value of patience, of staying cool when things got heated. But this? This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something else. He could feel it in the way the older attendant's eyes flicked around the room, avoiding direct contact, and in the nervous fidgeting of the younger one, whose hands wouldn't stop adjusting his name tag. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Snoop could feel the weight of it pressing down, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes hidden behind his trademark shades, giving him the upper hand in this unspoken game. Finally, Snoop's voice cut through the tension, smooth and steady like a bass line in one of his tracks. "Complaints, huh?" he said, his tone light but edged with disbelief. "Funny, I don't remember causing any problems." The younger attendant shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but the older one stood firm, his lips pressed into a thin line. There have been multiple reports, the older man insisted, his voice clipped and formal. Passengers are concerned about your presence. Your presence. Those two words hung in the air like smoke. Snoop let them linger for a moment, tasting the bitterness behind them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers laced together. The soft leather of the seat creaked under his weight, but Snoop's focus was sharp, laser-like. "You sure it's my presence?" he said slowly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "or you just don't like seeing someone like me in here?" The older attendant's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. That silence spoke louder than any words could. Snoop knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about perception, about prejudice wrapped up in polite words. The air in the cabin grew heavier, charged with an invisible tension that seemed to seep into every corner. Snoop could feel it pressing against his skin, but he stayed calm, his expression unreadable behind his shades. The younger attendant glanced nervously at his colleague, as if silently pleading to back off, but the older man's pride wouldn't let him. He stood his ground, but Snoop could see the cracks starting to show. Outside the window, the landscape blurred past, rolling hills bathed in golden light, distant trees swaying in the breeze. Inside the cabin, though, time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. Snoop slowly rose from his seat, his tall frame unfolding with a casual grace that belied the tension in the room. He wasn't trying to intimidate them, but his presence filled the space in a way that couldn't be ignored. "Look," he said, his voice still calm, still steady. "I paid for this ticket. I'm sittin' here, mindin' my business, not both errand nobody. If someone's got a problem with that, maybe they should be the ones gettin' off at the next stop." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a statement of fact all at once. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. As Snoop stood there, the tension in the cabin spilled into the hallway. Passengers in nearby compartments started to notice. Curious glances turned into hushed whispers, and soon enough, people were peeking out of their cabins, trying to get a glimpse of what was going on. Snoop caught snippets of conversation. "Is that Snoop Dogg? What's happening? Why are they bothering him?" One woman in a designer coat and oversized sunglasses whispered to her companion, just loud enough for Snoop to hear, "I told you he didn't belong here." Snoop's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. He'd heard it all before, felt this same energy in boardrooms, hotels, airports. But each time, it stung just a little bit different. Before Snoop could respond, a young man from across the aisle stood up. He looked like he was barely out of college, wearing a faded hoodie and clutching a camera bag. "Yo, that's Snoop Dogg," the young man said loudly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the other passengers. "Why you hasslin' him? He didn't do nothin', dot." The attendant stiffened, clearly unprepared for someone to step in. More murmurs rippled through the car, and a few people even nodded in agreement. Snoop turned slightly, giving the young man a nod of appreciation, but he raised his hand to signal it was cool. "Nah, it's all right, young blood," Snoop said, his voice smooth. "I got this." Turning back to the attendants, Snoop's expression hardened just slightly. He let the silence stretch again, giving them time to feel the weight of the room shifting against them. "You got two choices," he said, his voice low but firm. "You can either back off and let me enjoy my ride, or you can call your little security team and make a bigger mess than you're ready to handle. Either way, I ain't movin', dot." The older attendant's face flushed with frustration, but the younger one finally broke. He leaned in, whispering something urgently to his colleague. Whatever he said worked, because after a tense pause, the older man huffed and turned on his heel, storming down the hallway with his partner trailing behind. As the door slid shut behind them, Snoop eased back into his seat, adjusting his shades. The buzz of whispered conversations lingered, but the tension had lifted. The young man with the camera gave Snoop another nod, and a few other passengers shot him small smiles of solidarity. Snoop let out a slow breath, the adrenaline fading, but the feeling in his chest remained. It wasn't just about this moment, it was about every moment like it. But today, like always, he stood his ground. The train rumbled on, the landscape outside blurring past, but inside, Snoop sat steady, unmoved, and unapologetic. As the two attendants retreated, the silence they left behind wasn't just in Snoop Dogg's cabin, it spilled into the hallway, spreading like ripples on water. The gentle hum of the luxury train, once a soothing backdrop, now felt sharp and intrusive. Conversations in nearby cabins faltered, and curious eyes began to peek through slightly open doors. The tension wasn't just Snoop's to carry anymore, it was now woven into the atmosphere, clinging to every passenger who sensed something was off. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, usually a comforting white noise, now seemed to amplify the unease, beating like a drum in the background of an unfolding drama. From the corner of his eye, Snoop noticed a woman in a sleek designer coat leaning toward her friend, her voice a sharp whisper that still managed to cut through the cabin's quiet. "I told you he didn't belong here." The words weren't meant for Snoop to hear, but they landed with precision. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react, not yet. He'd heard worse, from people in higher places, but it didn't mean it stung any less. Another passenger, an older man with a stiff suit and a scowl to match, shot Snoop a disapproving glance before disappearing back into his compartment. The message was clear without a word being spoken: you don't fit here. But just as the negativity seemed to settle in, another voice broke the tension. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight of its own. "Yo, that's Snoop Dogg," a young man across the aisle said, standing up from his seat. He couldn't have been more than 20, wearing a faded hoodie and clutching a worn camera bag. His voice was steady, louder than a whisper but not confrontational. "Why you hasslin' him? He didn't do nothin', dot." The words echoed through the car, drawing even more attention. Heads turned, some with surprise, others with curiosity. The two attendants, still lingering at the end of the hall, stiffened visibly. For a moment, the air hung heavy with uncertainty. No one was sure what would happen next. But the young man's words had cracked something open. A middle-aged woman, sitting a few rows down, nodded in agreement, her voice soft but supportive. "He's right. Leave him be." Even those who didn't speak began exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from passive disinterest to quiet solidarity. It was subtle, but Snoop felt it, the shift in the room, the slow realization that not everyone was willing to stay silent. Snoop leaned back in his seat, his eyes hidden behind his shades, but his mind was racing. He'd been in the spotlight for decades, faced with both adoration and judgment, but moments like this never got easier. Why does it always have to be like this? He thought. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't making noise. He was just existing in a space where some people thought he didn't belong. But as he glanced at the young man standing up for him, Snoop realized something important. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every voice that had been silenced. Snoop sat up straighter, adjusting his shade slightly. He turned toward the young man, giving him a small nod of appreciation. "Nah, it's cool, young blood," Snoop said, his voice calm and steady. "I got this." It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a quiet assertion of control. Snoop didn't need anyone to fight his battles, but knowing people had his back. That meant something. The young man nodded and sat back down, but his simple act of courage had already sparked something in the cabin. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, no longer resting solely on Snoop's shoulders. At the end of the hallway, the older attendant's face had turned a deeper shade of red. His authority had been publicly challenged, and he didn't know how to regain it. The younger attendant looked ready to disappear into the floor, his eyes darting around nervously as if hoping someone else would step in and handle the situation. But no one did. The crowd's silent support had created a wall between Snoop and the unnecessary confrontation, and the attendants could feel it. They weren't just dealing with one man anymore, they were dealing with an entire train car watching closely. Snoop knew better than to escalate things. He didn't need to shout or cause a scene. His presence alone was enough. He sat calmly, letting the silence speak louder than words. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was control. He'd faced bigger challenges than this, and he wasn't about to give these attendants the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. The luxury cabin, with its polished wood and velvet curtains, suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on the attendants instead of him. Snoop had turned the space around him into something untouchable. After a long, uncomfortable pause, the older attendant finally huffed and turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he stormed down the hallway. The younger one followed, his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As the door slid shut behind them, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the cabin. The passengers slowly returned to their conversations, though the buzz of whispered words lingered in the air. Snoop sat back, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't need to celebrate the moment, his calm defiance had said it all. As the train sped forward, the scenery outside a blur of green hills and golden fields, Snoop let his thoughts drift. This wasn't the first time he'd faced something like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But every time he stood his ground, it sent a message, not just to the people trying to push him out, but to everyone watching. And as he glanced over at the young man with the camera bag, who gave him another small nod of respect, Snoop felt a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, you didn't have to raise your voice to make it heard. Sometimes, just being there was enough. The rhythmic hum of the train had returned to its steady beat, but for Snoop Dogg, the tension hadn't faded. As he lounged back into his seat, adjusting his shades, he knew this wasn't over. The attendants might have walked away, but their bruised egos were still lingering somewhere on this train. Snoop had been in enough of these situations to know that pride, when wounded, always found a way to retaliate. The polished wood of the cabin reflected faint streaks of the setting sun outside, casting long shadows across the walls. Snoop's reflection looked back at him from the glass, cool and collected, but beneath that exterior, he was calculating. He wasn't just fighting for his right to be on this train, he was fighting against something bigger, something that had followed him his entire life. As the train sped forward, Snoop could hear the murmurs continuing in the neighboring cabins. The earlier confrontation hadn't gone unnoticed, and now, like wildfire, the story spread. Some passengers leaned into the drama, their whispers sharp and judgmental. "I bet he's causing trouble," like they said, one voice hissed from behind a slightly ajar door. But others, the ones who'd seen what really happened, exchanged glances of quiet solidarity. The young man with the camera bag had returned to his seat but kept stealing glances in Snoop's direction, as if making sure his unexpected hero wasn't about to face another round of nonsense. The familiar whoosh of the sliding door snapped Snoop from his thoughts. This time, it wasn't the attendants. It was the conductor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a presence that demanded attention without saying a word. She wasn't wearing the fake politeness of the attendants, her authority felt real, grounded in experience. Behind her, the two attendants trailed like shadows, their faces stiff and unreadable. The older one had that same tight-lipped expression, but his eyes betrayed him, he wasn't here for a resolution. He was here for revenge. The conductor stopped at Snoop's seat, her gaze steady but not unkind. She didn't look at him the way the attendants did. There was curiosity in her eyes, maybe even respect. "Mr. Broadus," she began, her voice professional but without the condescension, "I understand there's been a situation." Snoop nodded slowly, his expression unreadable behind his shades. "Yeah," he said coolly, "seems like some folks can't handle seein' me ridin' first class." The conductor's lips twitched, almost like she wanted to smile but knew better. Instead, she turned slightly, glancing at the attendants behind her. The younger one looked like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him. The older one just stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "We've reviewed the situation," the conductor continued, her voice calm but firm. And there's no reason for you to leave the train. I apologize for any inconvenience. Snoop didn't react right away. He let the words hang in the air, savoring the subtle victory. But this wasn't about winning. It was about principle. Ain't about inconvenience, Snoop said, his tone still smooth. It's about respect. The conductor nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. Without another glance at the attendants, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving them standing there like school kids who'd just been scolded. The older attendant's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. For a moment, it looked like he was going to say something, maybe try to claw back some of his lost dignity. But one look at Snoop, still calm, still unbothered, and he thought better of it. Without a word, he turned and followed the conductor down the hallway. The younger one trailed behind, shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the car. As the door slid shut behind them, the cabin felt lighter, the tension finally easing like a pressure valve had been released. For a moment, the cabin was quiet. Then, from across the aisle, the young man with the camera gave Snoop a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had just gone down. A few other passengers exchanged glances, some even offering small smiles of support. Snoop didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. But knowing that people had seen the truth, that they'd witnessed the injustice and chosen to stand with him, that meant something. He leaned back in his seat, letting the rhythmic hum of the train wash over him. The ride wasn't over, but the battle had been won. As the train sped on, Snoop couldn't help but wonder about the ripple effect of what had just happened. How many people would go home tonight and talk about the man they'd seen standing his ground? How many would rethink their own biases, their own assumptions? But more importantly, how many would be inspired to stand up the next time they saw something wrong? Snoop knew this wasn't the last time he'd face something like this. But each time he did, he chipped away at the walls people tried to build around him. Snoop glanced out the window, watching the world blur past. The scenery was beautiful, rolling hills, golden fields, distant mountains bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was on the weight of the moment. Sometimes, just being somewhere people didn't expect you to be was an act of defiance. Sometimes, your very presence was enough to shake things up. And Snoop Dogg? He'd spent his whole life shaking things up. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and purple, Snoop adjusted his shades, popped his headphones back on, and let the music carry him forward. The train rumbled on, cutting through the darkness, but inside, Snoop sat steady, unmovable, and unapologetic. This wasn't just a ride. It was a reminder, to himself and to everyone watching, that respect wasn't given freely. It was earned, demanded, and defended. And Snoop? He wasn't going anywhere. The rhythmic hum of the train persisted, but Snoop Dogg knew the real noise was the tension hanging in the air. He leaned back in his seat, arms folded, shades reflecting the faint golden glow of the setting sun. The luxury cabin had grown quieter since the attendants left, but that silence felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Outside, the landscape blurred, a mix of rolling hills, scattered trees, and distant rooftops. But Snoop wasn't paying attention to the scenery. He knew the attendants weren't done. People like that? They didn't let things go. It didn't take long. The soft whoosh of the sliding door broke the uneasy calm. This time, it wasn't just the attendants. The conductor stepped into the cabin, her polished badge gleaming under the warm lights, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Behind her trailed the same two attendants, their postures stiff. The younger one looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but the older attendant? His face was tight with barely contained frustration, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might snap. Snoop didn't move. He didn't need to. His calm was his weapon. The conductor approached Snoop's seat with measured steps, her gaze steady but not confrontational. She wasn't like the attendants. There was authority in her presence, but it didn't come with fake politeness or hidden condescension. She felt like someone who'd seen enough of life to know when something wasn't right. "Mr. Broadus," she began, her voice level, "I understand there's been a situation." Snoop didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, his voice cool but clear. "Yeah," he said, "seems like some folks got the wrong idea about me ridin' first class." The conductor's eyes flicked briefly toward the attendants before settling back on Snoop. There was something in her expression, curiosity, maybe even respect. But she wasn't here to make friends. She had a job to do. "We've spoken to the staff and reviewed the reports," the conductor continued, her tone professional. "There's no evidence to support the complaints. You're not required to leave the train." Her words were simple, direct, but they carried weight. Snoop could feel the shift in the room, like a pressure valve releasing. The older attendant's face darkened, but he said nothing. The younger one just stared at the floor, his embarrassment palpable. Snoop let the silence stretch, letting the words sink in for everyone to hear. After a beat, Snoop finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Appreciate that," he said, nodding slightly. "But it ain't just about stayin' on this train. It's about respect." The conductor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. Maybe she'd seen this kind of thing before, maybe not, but she got it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked down the aisle, her steps echoing softly in the quiet cabin. The attendants were left standing there, exposed and defeated. The older attendant lingered for a moment, his face a mask of frustration. For a split second, it looked like he might say something, try to reclaim some shred of authority. But the look in Snoop's eyes, calm and unflinching, told him all he needed to know. There was no winning this. With a sharp exhale, the older man turned and stalked off down the hall, his posture stiff with humiliation. The younger attendant followed, his head down, avoiding every glance from the passengers who had witnessed the entire scene. As the door slid shut behind them, the cabin finally exhaled. For a few moments, the cabin was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, from across the aisle, the young man with the camera bag gave Snoop a nod, small, respectful, but filled with meaning. A few other passengers exchanged glances, some offering quiet smiles of solidarity. Snoop didn't need applause. He didn't need anyone to make a scene. The truth was out in the open, and that was enough. He leaned back in his seat, adjusting his shades as the train continued to rumble forward. As the train sped on, Snoop let his mind wander. He thought about all the times he'd been in situations like this, times when people tried to push him out of spaces they didn't think he belonged in. But each time he stood his ground, it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who watched, everyone who learned from it. He wondered if the young man with the camera bag would tell this story later. He wondered if some of the other passengers might think twice the next time they saw something unfair. That was the power of standing your ground. It didn't just change the moment. It changed people. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rolling landscape. The soft golden light filtered through the windows, painting the cabin in warm hues. Snoop watched the scenery blur past, but his thoughts were focused inward. This wasn't just a train ride. It was a reminder. A reminder that respect wasn't something given freely, it was something you had to demand sometimes. And when you stood firm, when you didn't let people push you out, it made a difference. For you. For everyone watching. As the train continued its journey, cutting through the twilight, Snoop pulled his headphones back over his ears. The beat kicked in, smooth and familiar, grounding him in the moment. The tension had passed, but the message lingered. He wasn't just a passenger on this train. He was a statement. A presence that refused to be ignored or dismissed. And as the music flowed through him, Snoop Dogg sat back, unmovable, unapologetic, and completely at peace. This wasn't just a ride. It was a victory. As the train sped forward, cutting through the fading light of dusk, Snoop Dogg leaned back in his seat, feeling the rhythm of the tracks beneath him. The confrontation had passed, but its impact lingered. It wasn't just about being asked to leave, it was about standing firm when people tried to push him out of spaces they didn't think he belonged in. He glanced around the cabin, catching the quiet nods and subtle smiles from passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal. Their silent support spoke volumes. It wasn't about making a scene, it was about making a statement. Snoop knew this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But every time he stood his ground, it wasn't just for him, it was for anyone who'd ever been judged by how they looked rather than who they were. As the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, Snoop adjusted his shades, popped his headphones back on, and let the music carry him home. It wasn't just a train ride. It was a reminder that respect isn't given, it's earned and defended. And Snoop? He wasn't going anywhere.